Okay. Good morning. It's another seminar of the Polish Economic Institute. Good morning. We have another seminar of the Polish Economic Institute. We're today presenting and commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Treaty of Maastricht and the convergence process that happened or did not happen after during this period of time. We prepared, the macroeconomic team at the Polish Economic Institute prepared a paper which shows I guess, some of the divergence and specializations of some of the EU countries and how much the EU core tightens its economic relations and increase the capacity of some certain economic institutions. But I'm not going to talk about this. This is going to be presented by Marcin Klucznik, who's an economist working at the macroeconomic team in Polish Economic Institute. So Marcin, the floor is yours. Then we're going to have a short panel discussion with some great guests from abroad. Marcin.
Thank you, Piotr. I guess you can see the presentation right now. Okay, thank you. As you have said, we are here at the 30th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty, a milestone for the European integration, and, well, perhaps the most important event in the modern history of Europe. And we are here to briefly summarize just one tiny but key economic aspect of the integration, that is the convergence process. One could say that there simply cannot be a full European integration without equalizing both standards of living and opportunities across the European countries. And that is basically what our report is about, whether these 30 years since the Maastricht Treaty did actually bring us closer and our economies are even closer, or maybe they're much further apart. So let us begin with our paper, and alas, the answer to these questions is not so obvious and simple as it might seem at the very first glance. At the very start, we consider the basic measure of convergence in terms of GDP per capita, that is the sigma convergence, a textbook-like, and we calculate this for the core EU 15 countries. That is the countries before the EU's enlargement in 2004. And what we observe actually is rather a divergence. Although there was some convergence up till 2004, 2006, since then we observe quite the opposite trend, as the differences in terms of development are actually increasing. And this divergent process was especially exacerbated by two economic events. One of them is the financial crisis of 2008, and the other one is the COVID crisis in 2020. And that is precisely why the developmental differences today in EU 15 are at a record high. They are approximately 20% larger than they used to be in 1995. And should we like to look in this thing in a more detailed way, we see that this divergence has occurred mostly due to the poor economic performance of the EU South, as countries like Italy or Spain are simply lagging behind the rest of Europe. And this may be especially visible in case of Italy, a country that simply used to be just as wealthy as Germany, but currently it is approximately 25% poorer, or maybe perhaps Greece that has experienced the greatest economic decline of them all. Hence, what we do observe in the EU 15 countries currently is simply two rates of growth, and it is South that is lagging behind. But if we would like to look at on this convergence process in a more general, complex way, to take a bigger picture and consider the whole European Union, EU 28, including United Kingdom, we do observe that convergence is actually happening. Its pace has declined since 2008. This is due to the southern countries lagging behind. Nonetheless, the development differences today are almost 20% smaller than they used to be in 1995. And from this perspective, crises were rather a temporary setback. We see this in case of a dot-com bubble in 2000 or a financial crisis in 2008. And most probably same will happen with the COVID crisis, as even currently we see a strong economic rebound in whole Europe, especially CE countries. And that is what leads us to answer why this convergence is happening. Well, basically, and in the most extent, it is thanks to the CE economies, as for the past 25 years, they have increased the share of GDP per capita on average from 38 to 62% of that in Germany. Some countries are performing outstandingly well, like Lithuania or Latvia, for instance. Others, like Poland or Romania, are experiencing a strong economic growth too. Finally, there's some like Bulgaria that are lagging behind a bit. Yet, even though, if we look at the Central Eastern European countries, we generally see that the past 25 years is a story of growth in development in all of them. And they were fueling the EU's convergence process in terms of GDP per capita. And now we can finally move on to the two other remaining aspects of the convergence. First of them is the institutional one. We measure the distance between EU's regions, that is South, Scandinavia, Central Eastern Europe, and the EU Central, in relation to the core EU countries, that is EU Central, and with respect to the two measures. One of them is general economic freedom, that is the panel on the left, and the other one is the quality of law, that is the panel on the right. And what we do observe is a strong institutional convergence that basically has happened, especially in case of Central Eastern Europe, where we had a transition from the planned economies to the free market ones, perhaps a great institutional change in the modern history of Europe. And although the differences today on the institutional level may seem to be significant, perhaps even due to some legal setbacks in the certain CE countries, if we take a longer picture, a longer perspective, we see that they are nowhere near to the ones before the Treaty of Maastricht. Yet there is another different measure of convergence, and that one is structural one. And we see that the structure of economies is actually not converging at all. We have calculated the Krugman specialization index and measured the relative distance of EU regions to the core EU states. And what we find that this convergence is actually not occurring, and that the EU regions are actually developing different sectors of economies, both in terms of industrial base and services. And should we put those things into more details and some examples, we basically see that EU regions currently are specialized. This is especially visible in case of, for instance, South, that is heavily reliant on hospitality services, and at the very same time has a low industrial base, or perhaps Central Eastern Europe countries that, on the other hand, on the opposite, they excel in industrial production, but these are mostly low and medium tech products. While finally we have the core EU states that, although the industrial base is actually quite smaller in relation to the gross added value, they actually specialize in high-tech production. And an open question that actually arises is whether this is a temporary adjustment and something that will eventually converge in a long-term process of European integration, or maybe a kind of a new normal, and we should expect this specialization only to deepen. And in order to at least provide some perspectives to answer this question, we generally provide two interpretations of the convergence process. One of them is a national one, and the remaining one is a federalist one. Both of them focus on convergence, but in a quite a different way. Hence, from the national point of view, growing disparities, especially like in case of EU South countries, they simply go directly against the spirit of integration and equalizing both products and the opportunities of living. And the other problem that arises from this national perspective is simply a lack of structural convergence in the EU's economies. As the question is, can we actually have a full developmental convergence without a structural one? And on the other hand, we have a federalistic perspective that generally tends to have a much more long-term view. It generally puts more weight on institutional matters and a slow process of building European federation. And from that perspective, developmental issues are not a question of if, they are rather a question of when. And to simply conclude with some policy recommendations, from this national perspective, they generally focus on enhancing structural changes in the economies in order to enable further economic growth. But there is an open question, and a hard one actually. Is it possible to do this without a further political integration? While if we think about this a more federalistic perspective on European integration, the general weight is on a common fiscal policy. The reasoning here is basically quite simple. Economic specialization is something that is beneficial to the EU as a whole. Hence, we do not really fear this lack of structural convergence, but it may create some risk of structural shocks in specific regions or countries of the EU. Hence, there is this need of fiscal policy as a tool to offset these kinds of risks. Additionally, on a federalistic perspective, we put more weight on increasing workforce mobility across the member states of the EU, and that is in order to fully explore benefits of monetary union on both political and economic level. That is the short presentation of the report we have written here at the Polish Economic Institute. Thank you for your attention, and Piotr, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcin, for summarizing the paper for us and for all the listeners. Please in mind that you can download it on the webpage, so it's easy to get through it if there are going to be some questions. Because as always, we invite everybody who's listening to ask questions through the Q&A. Our team will send me and remind me that the questions could come. So now for the panel discussion, and we have two great speakers. One is Zsolt Darvas, a senior fellow from Bruegel, a frequent guest of our different discussions throughout the years. So hello, Zsolt. And also Eulalia Rubio, who's a senior research fellow in economic affairs at the Jacques Delors Institute.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm gonna. May I start with you, Eulalia? Maybe through you can have a chance for an introductory remark. You know, what do you think about the paper or the process itself, and probably on the future of the integration? We have these two different narratives of interpreting the process, because we were quite, you know, we were split how to think what's going on. So
Yeah, thank you, Piotr, and thank you for inviting me. That's an interesting seminar. There are a lot of things in the paper, actually, so I cannot summarize all the things that comes to my mind. But maybe when I saw the paper, it made me think about one paper we wrote some time ago with Henrik Henderlein on the 25th anniversary of the Delors report. And we did a similar exercise. We were not forward-looking. We were just looking at what happened since the Delors report, and we tried to draw lessons whether we were right or wrong at the time on the Delors report, not the Maastricht. Yeah? So we looked what the Delors report said about several things. We look whether these things were put into the Maastricht Treaty, and then we look after the years whether we were right or wrong. And I remember that in many things, for instance, for fiscal rules, the conclusion was that we were quite right, actually, in the Delors report. I mean, the diagnosis was quite correct. It was very well seen that there will be problems in a monetary union, and we need some fiscal rules. If we put into place, a central bank model as the Bundesbank, we need some control on in terms of debts and deficits. Then, of course, there was a discussion whether it had to be the level of deficit on the level of debt, but the diagnosis was quite correct. And on the other hand, for convergence, we had a discussion on convergence. And I remember that one of the things we were saying is that in many things, it was not at all, the things we expect to happen, it didn't happen at all, actually. We were quite wrong at the moment in which we put into place the Maastricht Treaty and the Delors report on our vision of convergence. And so it was very nice to see how you look at this now. And in the Delors report, what we say is that there was a lot of attention on convergence before entering to the EMU. So mainly all the debate on convergence at that time was how we have to converge to enter into the EMU, whether it has to be real or nominal, or which processes, which types of which calendar to enter into the EMU, whether all member states had to enter or not. But there was very little discussion about convergence once inside the EMU, and actually the assumption at the time was that the EMU in itself would create convergence. There was this idea of the real exchange rate effect, actually, that would put member states, under discipline, because they would be more confronted to the competition within other member states, and they will not have this exchange rate instrument to adapt their economies. So in this, we were quite wrong, actually, and that's interesting. What you then the interesting thing when I was looking to your report is that at that time we didn't know that we were going to lurch. So that's another type of convergence, actually, And I think you're totally right in the report of saying that actually the story of Eastern-Western convergence is a story of success. I mean, I totally agree with the big picture. Actually, we still have a problem with then we can talk in more detail on the drivers or the causes of this problem. But now the problem of convergence is mainly the problem of non-convergence is mainly with the South, not with the Eastern European countries. But then maybe one thing that is also something that is now appearing, and maybe it's not reflected in the report, is that if we look at the picture also of the EU, we see overall convergence in terms of GDP, as you say, but we see also a problem of regional divergence, actually, within the countries. And that's something that is quite worrying, actually. We see convergence if we look at the national GDP, but we see in many countries a problem of, the capitals and the big cities are going very well, but some laggard regions are not going so well. And this is something that is already appearing at the EU agenda as a problem, and which is not, one could say why the EU level have to deal with these things or have to, it's something that has to be dealt at the national level, but it has implications for the EU as a whole also. And it has, for instance, political implications, because sometimes these, laggard regions are the ones that are less attached to the EU. So it's not something, to be neglected for the EU level. But I stop here because otherwise, there are many aspects in the report that we can discuss later on.
Okay, thank you, Eulalia. So, Zsolt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, and first of all for the great report, which really advise everyone to look at it in more details. Now let me start with the broader question, namely convergence of the EU 15 to the United States, because in the report, very much focuses convergence inside the European Union. But I think it's also important to recall that the EU 15 is not doing well when we, let's say, look at convergence to the US. I mean, after the Second World War, when most of Europe was destroyed and had to be reconstructed, there was a certain steady convergence of EU 15, so the longer standing members of the EU towards the United States, but only up to, let's say, the early 1980s. And since then, Europeans, even the Scandinavians or Germany, were not really able to converge further to the United States, which I think is itself a very interesting issue. But we, when we talk about the inability of the South to converge to Western Europe, we also need to talk about the inability of Western Europe to converge towards the US, which is certainly still the technological leader of the world. So I think this aspect that Western Europe or the core Europe, as you call, is not doing great. I mean, doing relatively well. I mean, people are living very well in the European Union, but in the past 4 decades, there were not much convergence toward the technological leader. So this is the first point. Now, on the second point, certainly I think the report very nicely, describes that it's mostly the Southern European countries which, had some, at least if you look at GDP per capita numbers, had some seeming convergence to the center, up to the global and European crisis. I would say seeming because most of this growth in GDP per capita was fueled by either unsustainable credit and housing booms in some countries, like Spain, for example, or growing public debt, like mostly in Greece. I mean, Italy was not doing well. I mean, Italy tried to cut the debt after joining the euro, but not, there was very limited progress on that. So the convergence process up to let's say 2004 and 5, 6, as your chart, Marcin, very nicely showed, I think was still a kind of artificial, because it was not based on a sustainable development. But what we see after that is a very long period of adjustment, and I think we have to understand why it's happening. So before, let's say 2007, there is a decade at least which was unsustainable, and coming out of that rather weak position, especially when it was reinforced by the Eurozone crisis, when even the existence of the euro was at question. I mean, everybody can recall 2012 when President Draghi said that he will do whatever it takes to save the euro, because indeed there was a grave risk that even some countries might fall out. So these countries suffered such a deep crisis, both an acute crisis and also a more chronic crisis coming from various structural weaknesses of the preceding decades. That it simply takes a long time to adjust. So yes, Southern Europe was not doing well, especially after 2007, and even more so after 2012. But before the COVID crisis, some of them, at least, for example, Spain or Portugal, made a lot of new reforms, lot of useful new regulatory measures. So they started to emerge from the deep crisis they had, and then came COVID. As you know, your report very nicely showed that these countries, for example, much more depend on tourism, and we know that tourism was the sector of one of the biggest hit sectors. So it's again not surprising that Italy and Spain were hit harder, much harder than the average of the EU. So again, these countries were also lucky with the COVID shock, I have to say. Now, how much time will it take them to get back in the years to come? I mean, it's certainly difficult to progress. I certainly have some question marks about that. But I want to emphasize that again, it was a long, unsustainable period coupled with a couple of shocks. So at least it's not that surprising that this country is not doing well. And my last point is just highlighting what Eulalia said about regional divergences. That this, which even characterizes Central European countries. So yes, on average, these countries are doing really well, especially if you look at the capitals. Typically, you know, per capita income in the capitals are even higher than in many Western European capitals. Mostly it's a kind of accounting issue because many companies are established in the capitals, even if some of their activities are outside of the capitals. But even in our countries, because I'm also from Hungary, so I can say that in our countries, you know, the peripheral regions within the countries are not doing that great. And yes, overall, we are moving to the right direction. But I would like to, again, underline that regional convergence, regional divergence within even Central Europe is a very important issue which needs to be addressed by policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Zsolt. So my first question, I'm going to start with Eulalia here, is on the biggest challenge ahead of the European integration. So seeing the different interpretations of the process through the last 30 years, good and bad, the issues that you talked about, especially on the regional convergence, is it the biggest challenge, or maybe there are more structural ones, so or institutional wise?
Well, this is one of the challenges, of course. When I think in the future, I mean, that's a big question, actually. What is the biggest challenge? I would say, of course, the first one is to recover well from this crisis and to recover in a balanced way. And in this respect, one important thing, now we are in this process of, you know, transforming the economy and society towards the carbon neutrality. So that's very important to do it well and to do it fair, and to make sure that all regions in Europe can adjust to that. And that implies a lot of, you know, changes and regulations, but we must be also conscious that implies also massive investment. That implies the capacity to facilitate and to do public and private investment. That's one thing we need to do to transform our economies and societies. And I say this because that links to the question of institutional convergence. We talk about, you know, the GDP convergence, and you talk about institutional convergence, but one thing that is important in terms of institutions is not only, you know, to converge in terms of laws, to converge in terms of, you know, the type of regulations we pass. We also need to converge, or at least to make sure that there is a minimum capacity to govern and to execute things. That's the more and more important, the more we are entering into this new terrain of transforming the economy towards a low carbon future, because and we see it now with the recovery plans. I mean, that implies we are entering into a new era of big states. Actually, we need big states capable of doing things, and particularly to invest well and to facilitate and to mobilize private investment. And in this respect, that's something that for me is very much important, even more, for instance, that some years ago, to make sure that all regions and all states in Europe have this quality of government, this minimum capacity. We don't need to have exactly the same governmental capacities or the same structure or whatever. But if we want to succeed, we need to make sure that all regions and states in Europe have the capacity to well invest towards this low carbon future. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. I mean, this cannot be substituted from the EU level. You need to have this capacity on the terrain, as they say. And then maybe one thing that also we discovered with the COVID crisis, which is also important for convergence, is the question of resilience. No, I think that we were not very much aware of that in the past. And I just mentioned now the question that Zsolt mentioned about Spain, for instance, the fact that Spain had a strong concentration on construction, and it has still a strong specialization on tourism. That was never highlighted as a big problem as now. I mean, now there's much more awareness of the need to have more diversified economies. That does not mean, I mean, I think we should be realistic also, and sort of say about the capacity to converge of the West to the EU, the US. I think if you look at all the debates on convergence for the last 30 years, we still have the same. We also say the same problems. We also detect the same. I mean, if you go to the Lisbon strategy, we had already the problem of gaps in investment and research and development within North and South. We have to not to be naive, and we have to be realistic. What can we obtain or achieve? But at the same time, of course, we have to try to do the best. And yeah, and in this sense, yeah, I think we have to try to converge in this type of things. We try to make sure that there's enough capacity to implement, to invest. We have to try to make sure that all member states, we can enter into the debate about structural convergence or not, or specialization. I tend to believe that structural convergence as such is difficult as a goal and is probably unattainable. And I feel more comfortable in the idea of, the idea that is very much used in cohesion policy of smart specialization. I mean, each one trying to specialize, but in a smart way, meaning that, for instance, in the case of Spain, you cannot, of course, they have to invest more in education, in research, but what you need is more innovation, more research, but maybe not totally changing the structure of the economy. That would be, dreaming, and they will not start to, increase a lot in manufacturing and specializing in high-tech manufacturing, but you could upgrade the sectors in which you are specialized and making more high added value that they are now. And that's I think that's my vision. I think it's much more realistic than just envisage or imagine that we will all converge in terms of structure of economic structures. And I stop here.
Thank you very much. It's yeah, but on the other side, it's very difficult to find any new innovation on breakthroughs in the tourism sector. So this is also difficult in some of the sectors which are have a lower value added to the economy. Zsolt, the same question on the biggest challenge from your point of view, looking back at the 30 years, and what could be the next big issue?
So if we, I think there are two questions: whether we talk about European economic integration or whether we talk about convergence. Now, certainly the two things are related. Now, on the first one, on economic integration, I mean, what comes to my mind is studies looking at how well the European single market performs. And these studies typically conclude that if you look at goods, we have almost perfectly well-functioning single market. You can buy whatever thing you want from another country very easily. Now, even more, you can do it online. There is a great price competition. You can benefit from cheaper prices elsewhere. The standards for goods are quite similar across the EU. I mean, not everywhere identical. I mean, if you, for example, buy something from electric appliance from Ireland, or then you will have a different plug than if you buy it from continental Europe. But nevertheless, I think for the goods sector, especially for industrial goods sector, I think economic integration has reached almost the limit what it can do. But the thing is completely different for services. Now, there are some services which are offered cross-border. But again, when I look at studies looking at the single market from the perspective of services, they do find many obstacles because they still don't have a well-functioning market. For example, pharmaceuticals complain, or healthcare providers complain that there are 27 national healthcare systems which all have some different rules and regulations, and if they would like to provide the same service in the 27 member states, they have to adapt to the 27 different regulations. And this applies to many also other different types of services and activities. And certainly until we have that, we will do have some fragmentations across borders. And that certainly limits, competition, limits the ability of companies offering services elsewhere. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's much harder than if there was, a unique single regulation across the whole European Union. So for further, I would say, economic integration, I think the greatest hurdle is indeed that the single market for services is limited, and there doesn't seem to be a great political appetite to address these issues. Yes, there are from time to time, there are some waves of proposed regulations and directives from European institutions, but still, I'm afraid the single market for services doesn't function well. And I think this is the place when we could indeed move forward if there was political will. But as I argued at the moment, and I don't see that. Now on the other issue, you know, for I would say convergence, I think the answer there is more difficult, because we do see some success stories, and certainly the most notable is Ireland, you know, which in the 70s, 80s, you know, had a per capita level well below the EU average, and now it is almost at the same level of Luxembourg, or at least the second highest per capita level across the European Union. But you know, Ireland is so special, not least because it's very benign tax regime, and also the way how certain profits are rerouted for Ireland. But at least there is one big success story within the European Union. And you know, for Central Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, I mean, East Central Eastern Europe, we do see indeed a strong convergence, which will probably continue for a couple of more years. But you know, if I would just, let's say, mechanically project Polish GDP per capita relative to German GDP per capita for the next 4 decades, then it would suggest that in 40 years from now, Polish GDP per capita will be above the German GDP per capita, which I couldn't imagine actually happening. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, and Poland will do that well. But I think that, you know, the current growth model that these countries have will also reach their limits sooner or later. Now, again, the report very nicely discriminated between, let's say, middle tech industrial production and high tech industrial production, and show that Central Europe is particularly strong in the middle and low tech segments, while Western Europe is much stronger on the high tech segments. And therefore, every government always says that, yes, we want to foster more research, more development, more high-tech industries, and so on and so on. And it's very nice in words. They also trying to do whatever they can. EU funds also help to some degree, hopefully, in this regard. But nevertheless, this switch for much higher value added, I think, will not just come, you know, on its own. And I'm afraid that sooner or later, this growth process will slow down. And indeed, a greater structural transformation would be needed for a full convergence. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question from one of the listeners, both to Zsolt and Eulalia. Referring to the two visions of integration, don't you think that the labor force mobility is a necessary condition for the federal vision of integration? We wouldn't have the same time. We wouldn't have at the same time regions with 15-20%. And 3% of unemployment, if there wasn't well-established labor force mobility between the countries. And this is actually something I also wrote down, because Zsolt, you talked about services, and I thought about labor, because you know, many people, and Marcin and the team also covered this in the paper, expected that, you know, if you have so high unemployment in the South, why don't those people just move around and find a better paid job in a different country? So I don't know who wants to answer first. Eulalia?
Yeah, I can have a try. Yeah, well, we know that mobility, labor force mobility, there are a lot of obstacles to that. So there is a limit to that. We can try to favor it, but we know that it creates a lot of, you know, the social disruptions. There is a language barrier. We also try, sometimes we complain a lot about the lack of mobility in Europe. And of course, if we compare to the US, we know it's different. They speak one single language, so it's a bit easier to move. There is culturally, it's easier to move. But I was thinking about what Zsolt say about the services, for instance, that even in the US, I remember having read a paper some time ago that compared the level of service, you know, uniformity in regulations in the US and Europe and the European Union. And the conclusion was that in the US, there is also a lot of barriers, actually. Each state has different regulations in certain types of services that are very much, specifically from, lawyers and these kind of things. But a lot of service activities are regulated at the state level, not at the federal level, and therefore there are also difficulties to have free movement of services. Even in the US, that is, the perfect case of one single country with one single language. Just to say that mobility, total mobility, and total free movement of services it's also very difficult. I don't want to look at the one that always says that everything is unattainable, but that's one point to take into account. Secondly, on Southern European countries and why it happens, this level of unemployment rate, I mean, it must be said that there was quite a lot of movement after the Eurozone crisis, actually. When you look at the figures, there were a lot of Spaniards and Italians going to the north to work. It was not something negligible. I mean, it was not massive, but still, it was important. And then third, maybe one general point, maybe when we when I try to think about this, what happened, why it happens or not that Southern European, why they did not move to the north. One general point is that it's difficult sometimes, and I think it probably is the same for the CE countries. I'm not an expert on CE countries, but Southern European countries are also very different, actually. We tend to talk about them as a group, but if you look, for instance, Italy and Spain, in Spain during the boom years that were mentioned by Zsolt, previous to the Eurozone crisis, there was an important influx of immigrants. So there was a country which received a lot of immigrants itself. So, and then we had the crisis, and of course you have a lot of unemployment because you have the natives, let's say, but you have also all the immigrants you have integrated in the economy during these boom years. That's a recurrent problem with the Spanish economy that is very unstable. No, we have boom and bursts. That's not at all the case in Italy. In Italy, it's a different problem, and it's a problem of structural low growth for several years. And they don't have this also, they neither have had this boom of immigrants coming to the economy. So even if you look at different Southern European countries, the situation is different. And the way of explaining unemployment is also different in Spain than in Italy.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. So
can I add the point to that?
Of course.
So I very much agree with Eulalia with everything she said. I would just like to emphasize one important thing, is that yes, labor mobility is a very important component of let's say, I would say, cyclical adjustments within an integrated economic area like the European Union. But in the long term, it can also lead to great troubles. I mean, look at, for example, the Baltics or Bulgaria or Romania, 20-30% of population has already left. And it's typically, the better qualified people who leave. So basically, these people are trained and educated when they were young in their source country. Then they, move to Western Europe because they find much better opportunities there. And leave behind a major gap. So yes, in the short-term cyclical adjustments, labor mobility can help a lot. I very much encourage that, and certainly European regulations could be more friendly to that. But for the source countries, just permanently leaving a large share of the labor force is very, very dangerous and just amplifies the very adverse demographic movements, which unfortunately characterizes both Southern Europeans and also Eastern European countries.
Okay, thank you. That's true. That's very much true. Okay, another question. In the age of decreasing role of the EU on the global stage and growing competition, both economic and political, with China, is convergence an economic asset, or is it decreasing European competitiveness? That's an actually interesting question. I don't know, who wants to answer first?
Zsolt, go ahead. I want to start off.
Okay, Zsolt.
So I don't think that there is my first thinking is that there is a close association between intra-European convergence and, let's say, the way we compete with China. Now, let me try to explain. So China is a very special country. I mean, all of well. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, it was a relatively poor economy and basically moved, massive amounts of people from the rural sectors to both industry and services. But, nowadays China is became a middle income economy. And, at the same time, they spend billions on high tech and education. and they are trying to do, you know, as much as they can to compete with top US and top European research centers in all many, you know, different segments of the economy. So, and all of first, and also, I mean, there's the big question also is certainly the economic system and the state support, which is received by research centers and also companies. Now, so if we compete with China, you know, what we have to do is we have to basically strengthen the knowledge base of a knowledge, I wouldn't say leadership, but that is the research capacity at the European level, which, you know, we do try both at the EU level by Horizon 2020 and other EU funds, maybe even more by you know, various national funds. So I see that's, you know, basically an area where we should strengthen our you know, competitive position regarding China. But on the other hand, you know, if I look at economic convergence within Europe, you know, I don't see a direct, you know, connection how this can relate to that, because I think those days when, you know, China was competing with cheap labor are gone. So now wages in China maybe certainly cheaper than it's in Luxembourg, but higher than in Bulgaria. So I think this wage competition, which was a characteristic of the Chinese economy, let's say 20 years ago, I think it's not anymore the case. So I think, you know, if you are trying to help economically weaker European Union countries to converge and also to move more to higher value added, at best it can even strengthen Europe's competitive position with relative to China. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was the second, and I think up to this moment, last questions that we had from the audience. And I'm going to ask just one more, and I think we're gonna finish here. So it's a very interesting panel. Another one. Okay. Very little was said about the euro as a mechanism of convergence. If you look at catching up, it was rather thanks to internal market and not because of the euro. How one can see it in the future? So the question about the euro, I also have one which I wanted to ask. So this kind of covers it here. So this is the last question for today. I don't know, Eulalia?
Yeah, well, it's a very important question, actually. Yeah, when you think about Europe, I mean, I say at the beginning that when we did this paper on the Delors report, there was very little attention on the convergence after the creation of EMU, because there was this assumption that, you know, mainly the effect of the euro would be through, you know, the reinforcing the single market in some sense, you know, like creating more capacity, more facilities to trade between the countries. But there was not at all, I mean, and that's why, you know, the assumption was that it will be an engine of convergence, because it will confront member states each other to compete, and while not having, you know, the exchange rate instrument that would force member states to do efforts to improve their competitiveness. But there was not at all a vision of, you know, of what happened in the end. That was, you know, the diversion effect of the single monetary policy, actually. The fact that we had, you know, the monetary policy setting one single, you know, interest rate policy, which in the end had this perverse effect of, you know, creating this massive influx of capital to the south to finance unproductive sectors like construction, and therefore that, you know, lose all discipline, all capacity to discipline these countries to do efforts to improve their competitiveness. Now, I think we draw lessons from that, actually, during the Eurozone crisis, and part of the reforms that we put into place, and you know, the roadmaps they were put into place at that time were to resolve this problem. Apart from the fact that we look more, you know, we put instruments to monitor more closely the imbalances that were at that time not observed at closer level. We also do efforts to, you know, to strengthen the level of surveillance and the regulations of banks, and also the banking union, let's say, the fact of putting into place a single structure to bank resolution. But this is not complete, actually. So for me, the solution would be to complete this part of the EMU, actually, because we have a bit forgot about that, because this new crisis has not so far touched upon this part of the economy, this for financial markets, but still it's something that is incomplete from the last effort to reform the EMU, which was based on the lessons drawn from the crisis. So I think the euro, I mean, if I say it's a mechanism of convergence of divergence, I mean, that depends on how you look at this. I think we fail to see some divergence capacity of the construction of the monetary union. And we have resolved so much this now, but still we could do something more to make sure that this doesn't happen again in the future, actually.
Thank you. And Zsolt, this is going to be probably the last chance to say something. So
yes, so I in fact did a specific research focusing on Central Europe by comparing countries which already joined the euro, like Slovenia, Slovakia, the Baltics, and so on, and countries which were outside. And what I looked at is how these countries were able to do the adjustment after the global and euro crisis of the late 2000s and early 2010s. And the conclusions were, I mean, might sound simple, but it is a conclusion that there were countries doing well both inside the euro and also outside the euro, and countries doing badly inside the euro and outside the euro. So it means, I mean, coming back to the question of what role it can play for integration and convergence. I mean, first of all, I mean, these results underline that it's absolutely necessary to follow good policies, irrespective whether you are in the euro or outside of the euro. It also means that, countries can be successful without joining. I mean, like Poland and Hungary, at least the current governments are very much against joining the Eurozone. But if they decide to join, they can also be similarly successful. So my ultimate conclusion was that since all new member states that joined the European Union, they legally committed also to join the euro whenever they can, and I think all countries in the Visegrad region would be able to do that. So if someone makes a commitment, that commitment has to be honored. So that's where overall I'm very much in favor of joining the euro, but not because that would generate some extra growth, but because this is what we committed, and this also delivers that. I mean, we are in a European Union where we make a commitment and we honor those commitments.
Okay, thank you very much. There are no more other questions. So one could say about the euro, good, bad, who knows, on the development of some European countries. But of course, as Poland is committed on entering the eurozone in the future, but the future means could mean 50 years, could mean 20, or could be 5, depending on the certain policies and the majority that could change the Polish constitution, because it has to be changed also in our country. I think this was a very fruitful and interesting debate, both on political economy and on the process of convergence and integrations, which as Zsolt said, are not the same things. And I think we also kind of show in our paper that you need to look at this process from different angles. The European integration is not finished. The Maastricht Treaty was a milestone, a very important milestone for the European Union. I guess we showed that in the paper on some of the processes that happen and have a positive impact, and some which probably have no easy resolution in the next years as to the process of convergence, and also in terms of how the integration process should go. So Thank you, my macro team from Polish Economic Institute. Thank you, Zsolt Darvas, for being with us. Thank you, Eulalia Rubio, also for being with us and talking and taking part in this discussion. Thank you, everybody who was listening and is going to watch this this debate in the future on the internet. So thank you very much.